Hello and welcome to the Leadership Edge. I am your host, Ted Gorski. The Leadership Edge focuses on those topics that affect leaders on a daily basis. My name is Ted Gorski. I'm your host. I am a leadership and executive coach from Get Your Edge. And what we do in the show is really talk about main topics that are going to affect you as leaders on a daily basis. Now, today's show is all about listening and listening skills. Now, to show you an example of that, producer Bill in the last show said, "Hey Ted, your shirt was a little bit too light, so look at me today. I end up putting a nice orange shirt so I don't have to blend into the background." Talk about listening skills and how they impact one's performance. Right, producer Bill?
I'm sorry, Ted, did you just say something?
Producer Bill, here we go. See, do you experience this? Are you in the office and are you talking with people and you're feeling that you're not being listened to? Well, maybe at home it's the same way. Maybe your significant other. Maybe it's your kids. Well, today's show is going to really focus on that whole concept of listening and how it affects the whole concept of conflict. So we're really going to focus on that today to really help you understand what you can do as leaders to really be more effective in both these categories. Now, to start off, there's a formula that I've put together that I give to my clients when I'm coaching them in the whole concept of any skill set that they're trying to do as leaders. The whole equation is perception equals behaviors plus actions. Now, what do I mean by that? The perception as you as a leader is going to depend on two factors, your behaviors and your actions. So, for example, if you say to your team, "I'm approachable, I'm always open," but if your actions are one where your door in your office is always closed, or when you are going out of your office, you don't have any time to spend with your team if they have a question. What happens is those two things, your behavior and your actions, does not support what you just said in terms of being approachable. And when there's a misalignment, that's when there's impact for leaders. So the whole goal is to make sure that each of these things are aligned. So if you say you are approachable, it means your door is open. It means when people come into your office, maybe some of your behaviors is that you pull away from the PC and really look at the person eye to eye, like active listening. So it all comes into an alignment. So today, we want to keep this equation in mind when you talk about yourself, when you say you're a good listener in dealing with conflict. Your behaviors and your actions must support the perception that you're trying to show other people. So let's talk about listening. Why is it so vital? Well, the whole concept here is listening is good business. It is a downward effect. By listening effectively, there's a clarity of understanding what has to get done. And by having clarity, you're able to respond appropriately, whether it's doing an action or something you need to do to effectively solve an issue. And by doing that, you're going to have better communication, and it's going to support cooperation and even collaboration amongst other people. You're going to build better rapport skills, which again, by definition, is give and take. And by definition, it's going to increase business. So listening does have an enormous effect on how it affects you and how it affects your business. So let's talk about the difference between the two. Because I talk to people all the time in my coaching sessions, and I go, "Oh yeah, Ted, I'm a great listener." Or I hear people. Well, you know what? Those are two different assets of how we deal in communication. Let's first talk about hearing. Hearing is the ability to accept and transmit sound waves from your eardrum to your brain. Like right now when you're listening to this fabulous show. You're hearing my voice, and it's transmitting from your eardrum to your brain. So you're actually physically hearing the sound waves that I am transmitting to you. Listening, on the other hand, is putting meaning in that transmission. You now hear the physical transmission, but now what you do from a listening perspective is you put it into meaning that affects you. So the whole concept here is we want you to be better listeners, not better hearers. Because when you're hearing, you're just transmitting the sound waves. Listening means that you're putting in solid meaning to that translation. So, let's talk about some realities here. You cannot not communicate. You get that? You get that, Producer Bill? You cannot not communicate. What we're talking about here is that you communicate every time you interact with someone, even if you don't say a word. Because some of your language, as we talked about in other shows, come from your body language in the tone of voice you use. Words are really not that important. So in all situations, you're always going to communicate. So the whole concept to be a great listener is you have to catch all those various things that are happening. As someone is talking to you, what does their body language say? Part of body language is the use of the hands. It could be facial expressions. But the whole concept is you really have to be attuned because what people are saying is coming through there. Have you ever had everyone say to you, "Don't look at me like that"? Has that happened to you, Producer Bill?
Yes, Ted.
See, I knew that. See, I knew that about you. Or, don't use that tone of voice on me. So the whole idea is that is something that's communicating to you. So remember, you always communicate. Second point, when contact is made, communication will occur. It ties into the first point, and we don't need to belabor that. So whatever you're contacting somebody, whether it's on the phone, even through email, there is some communication that's occurring. The meaning are in the people, not the words. As we talked about listening, the meanings that people interpret come through them. They interpret it through them. And as we talked in previous shows about different styles, people interpret things a whole lot differently. So the key thing I want you to walk away from here in today's show is that the meaning is within people. It's how they interpret things. And as a leader, it's really important to understand that. And the last point I want to make here, which is really, really important, I cannot stress this. And Producer Bill, write this one down.
Will do, Ted.
All communication is received, but 70 to 90% is filtered or changed by the receiver. Think about that. 70 to 90% of your message is being filtered. So even though you think you're being clear, people are actually filtering what they're hearing. That has a huge impact in terms of listening, and this is why it's really vital that we get on the same page whenever we're communicating with others, because that could really impact our results. So let's talk about speaking and listening rates, because this is actually fascinating. Do you know that we can speak at 150 words per minute? Now, you haven't been at my family gatherings, because I'll tell you what, 150 words is on the low end. But on average, people can speak at 150 words a minute. We, believe it or not, can listen at 500 words a minute. So you have the ability to listen a whole lot more. It's just like any skill set, it hasn't been developed. And that's the one thing that we don't teach young kids in school or even in college, is how to be better listeners. We always teach them what to say next or what to do next, but we're not teaching them how to be proper listeners. So the whole idea of it is you have the capability and the capacity to listen more and gather additional meaning. So what that leaves us is with 350 words to tune out. So this is where, in those 350 words, you can think about your next vacation. You could be thinking about the weekend. You say to yourself, I got to pick up my dry cleaning at the end of the day. Or you know what, my next meeting's in a half an hour. Oh, where am I going to go for lunch? What's for dinner tonight? So you can see what happens in that situation, how miscommunication can occur. So it's vital to understand that in that tune-out stage is where we miss a lot of our particular meaning. So here's a fun little exercise that I do, and because of the time of the show, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on this, but in my various workshops, I'll actually pass out this particular jambalaya of letters. In my instructions is, from this jambalaya, I ask the various participants to remove 6 letters. Because after you remove 6 letters, there's a word that remains. Now, if you're like typical people, you're going to be looking for and removing 6 letters to try to find that, versus trying to remove 6 letters, S-I-X-L-E-T-T-E-R-R-S. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, because for listening skills, one of the things that a lot of people do is what we call selective interpretation. In this little funny example, and Mr. Producer Bill, can you bring that slide back up? People are always trying to remove 6 of the letters in the particular jambalaya. But wasn't I clear? I said remove 6 letters. But your interpretation was to remove 6 individual letters versus the word 6 letters. And you know what? It's a fun little exercise, but we do this all the time in what we do when we selectively interpret. So it's really important for you as leaders not to do this, because we filter through our own particular meaning. So how does this affect conflict? Well, conflict is a situation where if we're not listening properly, as a result of that, it's going to cause the conflict to escalate. So my whole question here when I work with leaders is, how do you handle conflict? What's your interpretation of conflict? Do you find it good? Do you find it that it's an evil that has to be avoided? Well, the reality is conflict is always going to occur. But our whole interpretation of how conflict is going to impact how we handle it. What I try to teach my leaders that I work with is the whole concept is that conflict is not bad. It is something that has to be addressed, and it's also a sign that we have to work on things to be more focused on what we're doing. But to put the particular conflict in the corner, roll up the carpet and tuck it away does not solve it. It actually makes it worse. And the longer you let it go, the larger it gets. The whole idea of it, though, is conflict, once handled, will take you less time than if you let it kind of fester for a while. So, here are some key principles. As I mentioned, conflict is inevitable. It will happen. It doesn't matter what situation you're in, it will be there. Your whole goal as a leader is to be somewhat comfortable with it, to understand it, to understand what it is. Conflict is not always bad. Conflict can be good. And again, how you view it will help show you how you're going to interpret it. The only person that you can control is yourself. The whole concept here on conflict is that your approach to conflict will really affect how you can control it. You can't control the other person, nor do you want to. The whole idea of it is that you can control yourself, which means that you can control your perceptions of it. And as I mentioned earlier, if you don't deal with conflict early, it will escalate. I won't tell you how many times I coach my leaders, and as they bring up a situation that they've been dealing with, what's been happening is they let it fester for a long period of time. And it's gotten worse. And what it's happened is it's caused the conflict to get so much bigger, it's going to take so much time. And when I asked the original question of when did this occur and what was the original situation, it was a situation we could have handled at a much smaller level. It took a fraction of their time. But it escalated to a point that it took it to be worse and became a death for con situation. So what I say to you is, don't let it lie, solve it up front. You'll be glad for it, and it'll take you less time. So let's talk about the different approaches to conflict. Let's talk about the different styles. And because of time, we can't spend a lot of time here. But the whole concept is there's 4 approaches to dealing with conflict. Now, if you look at this grid that's on the screen, on the bottom, concern for self means what's the focus on yourself? Do you have a low concern about what you want to do in this conflict, or do you have a high concern? In terms of the grid on the left-hand side going from north to south, concern for other, which means do you have a low concern for them or a high concern, which is in that blue box. So for example, if you have a low concern for yourself but a high concern for the other, it means that you accommodate. That strategy means that you are going to allow the other person to get what they want in that situation. You're not really going to be too concerned what we want, but because you want to sustain that relationship, you're going to give the other person as much as they want. If you look on the lower right in terms of compete, it's the opposite. It means that you have a higher concern for yourself and a lesser concern for the other, which means you're going to compete to what you want, which can be quite disastrous because this creates a win-lose scenario, which in the long term as a leader is not going to be effective for you. The whole concept is the top right, which is collaborate, which is a high concern for yourself and a high concern of others. That's your win-win. And that's what I coach my leaders on, is every situation can be a win-win. And if you want that to happen, you have to approach it in that scenario. A win-win mindset is going to help you find the proper solution to be effective. But it also is going to leverage your listening skills, because you need to listen what the other person's position is. And you need to understand it fully. So the whole concept is to really focus on that top right-hand corner. And by the way, real quickly in the bottom left, avoid, it means a situation that you neither don't care, and it's usually a strategy where you both just kind of get away from the conflict, which is not necessarily the best thing. So, how do we handle it? What do you need to do? What are some of those things? Well, there's a little exercise that I do with my leaders, and I challenge you to do this. It's called dealing with hot buttons. It's understanding what are those things, it's called triggers, that could get you to a higher emotional level very quickly. If someone says something in a certain way, do you immediately go to anger? If someone looks at you a certain way, does it get your emotions to go up higher? The whole concept here, especially in dealing with conflict, is trying to identify those triggers that are going to cause you to go up much higher. So what I challenge you in for the next week is to write a list of those things that are triggers for you, so that in a conflict situation, the more you can identify, the less power they have over you. Because the whole concept here is we want to keep you in balance. What I teach my leaders is that when you get emotional and you kick up to a higher level, what ends up happening is if you make decisions from here in an emotional level, they're not the most effective decisions. And if you're in conflict situations from here at an emotional level, it's not going to be a very collaborative solution. What I teach leaders is if they understand their triggers, it's not going to cause them to shoot up, it's going to cause them to stay in balance. And the longer you can stay in balance, the more effective you're going to be in conflict and the more effective you're going to be in your decision making. So this is a challenge that I say to you. Because the reality, here's kind of the things that you have to do to maintain a relationship whenever you're in a conflict. The key thing here is to make sure that you encourage participation, which means that you're listening and you're asking the other person their view. You're asking their position. Actively listening. Listening to what they're saying, but also what they're not saying. What's their body language tell you? What's their tone tell you? Thirdly, step back. Don't take an aggressive approach. Step back and survey the situation. Be curious. Find out what's happening and why it's happening. Because the more you can step back, the better you're going to be in conflict situations. And lastly, determine fact from fiction. A lot of things that happen is that leaders jump to conclusions. They'll hear something and go, ah, that's fact, where in fact it may be fiction and not fact. So what I want you to do is really look at what is fact, what is fiction whenever you're dealing with conflict, and determine it effectively. I currently coached a person who was actually shooting from the hip, because in conflict situations what they were doing was taking everything as fact. He never ascertained what was fiction. So you can imagine what was happening in conflict situations. Really kind of disastrous. So the key thing is I want you to be able to determine the difference. So, as we talked about on an earlier show, and because we're running late on time on the show here, the key thing to remember here is we talked about this in terms of communication styles. The only style that enjoys conflict is the dominant style, which is that assertive, aggressive person. All the other styles tend to tolerate it. So you can see what happens in conflict situations. We have one style who's the dominant who wants to address issues, whereas the others will keep it close to their vest. So it's very important to understand that people will deal with conflict in different situations. Because here is the other thing I want to talk about is the conscious versus the unconscious mind. If you see here, think of it as an iceberg. Your conscious mind is the iceberg that's above the sea level here. And usually that is the smallest part of the iceberg. The deeper part of the iceberg is the unconscious mind. That, as you can see from this picture, that is where the majority of the situations occur on how it drives people's behaviors and attitudes. Why do I bring this up on this screen, and why do I bring it up in the whole concept of listening and conflict? Is because the larger portion of the unconscious mind drives people's conscious behavior. And it's important to understand what may be happening below sea level. Now, here is from a communication model. NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. It's the whole process of how language can affect someone's state and emotions. I could take a whole show on this, but the whole process of this slide that I want to bring up is for you to realize one thing. An external event that someone is experiencing actually gets represented internally inside a person. That creates what's called a state. A state is how they are feeling from that experience. And from that physiology situation, it creates their behavior. So what you can see in this little slide is that in a person's state, how they interpret that external event is going to impact their behaviors towards something. This has a play into what happens in conflict situations as well, because you have one of these things as well. And we probably could spend a whole show on this, but the whole concept here is for you to understand there's a lot of things going on, not only in you, but in someone else as they're interpreting a situation. So, one thing I want to, as we're wrapping up today's show, that I want you to realize about the unconscious mind is the whole concept of positive and negative commands. Now, if I say to you, don't think of an orange kangaroo, what are you probably going to start thinking about? You're right, an orange kangaroo. Except producer Bill is probably going to think of a pink kangaroo. So, why does this happen? Because the unconscious mind cannot think in negatives. You know, the whole idea here is for you to understand is that whatever as leaders, what we tend to do is we tell people, especially in performance reviews, you know, in the coming year, don't do this, or do less of this. Well, what you've just done is cement the opposite, which is you're telling them to do it, because the unconscious mind does not process negatives. So as a leader, it's important to kind of adjust your language, and in the next slide, we're going to talk about that. I want you to focus on what you do want. Instead of saying, don't do something, say, I would like you to do more of this. So the whole idea is that I want you to focus on what you do want. Because here are some examples. You know, don't touch the glass. Keep your hands on the table. Don't drop the ball. Catch the ball. So the whole idea as leaders, especially when you're dealing with conflict, you want to avoid the whole concept of don't. And how your language comes across is going to impact how you're going to be handling with that conflict. So you can see we covered a lot in today's show in terms of the whole concept of listening, conflict, and we even talked a little bit about the subconscious and the conscious mind. So your homework is to work on your triggers. And I want you to identify, one way you can do that is think of a situation that occurred recently that didn't go well. Maybe it was a meeting at the office. Maybe it was a sales meeting that you felt your emotions kick in. I want you to replay that and say to yourself, what tones did I hear that brought me into an emotional state? What words were used? What body language did I notice that really triggered me? The more you can identify those, the better. And this is going to be a work in progress. The whole goal here is I want you to build this list, but I want you to continue to build it. Because I will tell you from my experience coaching leaders, when I have them go through this, the more we identify, the more effective they are in the long term dealing with conflict. And that's my whole purpose here today. So again, thanks for tuning into the Leadership Edge. If there's anything we can do to help you with your leadership or team building, we'd love to talk to you at www.getyouredge.com. Again, thank you for listening to today's show on the Leadership Edge. See you next show.